The World Bank has said that developing economies have now spent 3 consecutive years paying more in debt servicing than they receive in fresh financing as global economic volatility intensifies pressure on public financing. For Nigeria, let's see our status at this time. We see that Nigeria's total public debt was at 152.4 trillion naira. In dollar terms, you're talking about $99.7 billion. That was as at mid-2025. Domestic debt accounted for about 52.9. If you could have the slide, please, that would be nice. Thank you so much, my colleagues. The domestic debt accounted for about 52.9%, with external debt making up for the rest. And the projection is that it will hit about 34.6%, 34.6% and 35% of the GDP at the end of this year. But I guess we've been in worse places, yeah? That's what we saw in the slide just before we came on. The situation has improved compared to what we had in 2024. This is slightly higher than 33.9 that was recorded last year, reflecting continued borrowing to fund government spending. Of course, once there's a deficit in the budget, then there has to be borrowing to make up for that. Let's see if we're in a good place or not. And we have right here in the studio lead partner at Cardinal Professionals, Mr. Emmanuel Onasami. Mr. Onasami, Happy New Year. I think it's the first time I'm seeing you in 2026. Yeah. Yeah. So we see that the situation has improved when we're coming from 2024. I think we should do more than 90% of our budget or so for debt servicing. But I mean, when we see the projection for this year, for instance, looking at from 34.6% to 35%, are we good, or does it look like we are on a positive trend?
So to put things in the proper perspective and context, when you're measuring debt stock, you always want to measure it with a benchmark to say, in the class of Nigeria as an economy, emerging economy, what is the benchmark? And if you look at the OECD figure we project that if you are still doing between 50 to 55% of your GDP, you should be fine. From the statistics you read out, this year we are about 35% of our GDP, and that means that is it entirely bad? We can say that it's not entirely bad. But when you look at sustainability and what the debt stock are being used for, and looking at the environment that we find itself, then there may be reason for us to self-reflect and check again whether borrowing as a strategy is still a way to go for us as a country. And you could hear from the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Wali himself, that he said that Nigeria has to cautiously look into its debt strategy and look internally for how to generate funding. If you backtrack, you will see that from inception, starting from the regime of even Obasanjo regime, where he was able to broker the Paris Club deal and get some debt for
the impact of that one seems long gone. And, unfortunately.
From that, every government has been coming around to say, well, we want to borrow to sponsor infrastructural development. That has always been the biggest reason, for going out to borrow. And you may then want to match the infrastructural development since then. But what has happened is that, when you're borrowing, if you're not careful and not very strategic with your borrowing, and you don't have fiscal discipline to ensure that those funds are used for the purpose of what they are meant for, the problem is that you may get to a place where Nigeria is gradually crawling to, where you are now borrowing to service your debt. Because your debt stock.
I think that's what the World Bank is warning against. So a lot of emerging economies seems to be borrowing to service existing debts.
If you look at the Appropriation Act for this period, we have about 15.21 trillion budgeted for debt servicing. And you have a target revenue of like 33 trillion. That means whatever income you are bringing in, about 47% of it has already been earmarked for servicing debt.
And you're not even sure you can hit that revenue, because when you look at oil, which is our mainstay, it's not, and this one is about 62. It's less than the target. So
yes, just
we can't even be sure that we can hit that revenue.
Yeah, just yesterday, NUPRC, churned out their data,
Yes.
confirming that, even our OPEC quota, we are not unable to meet it, leading to about 1.46 trillion,
Loss in
revenue
revenue.
shortfall. And those are some of the things that, before we start talking about, whether debt is a good strategy. I've seen a lot of people in the past, from a political stand-up and say, oh, I'm of the school of thought that we have not borrowed enough. I'm of the school of thought that we have borrowed enough. Notwithstanding all that, we need to look inward and say, if you run Nigeria as a private concern, and you want to go borrow, you have to do a justification for the use of fund. And in the past, that is the accountability that we have not seen from the part of the government for the justification for the use of fund. And also, beyond the use of fund, your revenue, tightening your fiscal policy around ensuring that, your revenue streams. And look at our Past Appropriation Act. Nigeria has not been able to do more than 60% of its revenue target over the year. So what could be going wrong? We have the Dangote refinery in Nigeria. Even if you're saying that you are diversifying the portfolio, even in the oil and gas sector, OPEC quota speak about your export. Dangote in Nigeria is your domestic consumption. If you can tighten up your, investment in the oil and gas sector, you can easily do more, ensuring up internal
So,
income.
Mr. Antonio, I hear you. I hear many things from what you're saying. The first thing I'd like to bring up is, are the monies being borrowed used for what they say to be used for? Because mostly what we hear is we're borrowing for infrastructural development. Do we, at the end of the day, actually see those infrastructural developments?
Yes, like I said, the justification put forward for borrowing has always been infrastructure, whether through a concessionary arrangement, whether through an offshore partner, coming to do one project or the other. But the fact still remains that when you put together the total debt stock that since democracy from 2015 till today, and you measure it within the infrastructural development, I think your guess is as good as mine. There's still a huge gap there. And that speaks to the fiscal discipline of the regimes that we've had over time. I tell you of the fact that, it is a matter of very soon, if we don't take care of the fact that, whatever fiscal discipline that is needed to ensure that, debt income are used for the purpose of development and making the economy friendly for investors, going this route of amassing debt will further make the environment not attractive for investors because the macroeconomics are becoming terrible by the day if you continue to go there.
But we see the government, I think, was it from last year or 2 years ago, where they turned more to domestic borrowing. So that should cost us less, but it's still debt anyways.
Yeah, so, and at that point, it was almost like we don't have any option. You understand what I'm trying to say? Because when it comes to debt strategy, you always want to go for long-term debt, that reduce the burden of servicing an obligation on you month on month, But because, the way the fiscal regime has been managed over time, it becomes less attractive, because every debt comes with a
But
covenant.
every instrument, every auction the government comes out with is always oversubscribed.
Yes, because it's good for the JP Morgan boys. They can always come in on a short term, put in the yield are attractive, and then they put in the fund, and then they go out immediately, unlike long-term fund that you can use for long-term planning and, economy. So it's more like, oh, I need money to pay salaries, then I go raise a short-term instrument. And that's one of the things that the government has to look in for, moving away from short-term measures to longer-term measures for the purpose of sustainability.
So, as it is now, you talked about, I talked about what the fund is being used for. You talked about fiscal discipline and leakages. How best or what else should be put in place to manage this debt stock?
So, like I said earlier, Mr. Wale has mentioned that we have to rethink our debt strategy as a nation. And if you also follow the reports, the Senate still believes strongly that there's no way out of this. You may still have to go borrowing.
Even though some Nigerians are beginning, the voice is calling for asset management instead of borrowing is growing.
Borrowing. So the approach is that there has to be some ingenuine, creative thinking going on with the government. And to look at it, let's look at the tax environment. We have the new tax laws. The new tax laws are made for measures for you to increase the tax net. if you are able to commit to seeing to it that, those measures as recommended by the committee and, passed into law are implemented, government is able to show up more taxes from more quarters rather than what we used to have from fewer people before now. Look at what I mentioned earlier about tightening your efficiency within the oil and gas space, and also look at unlocking assets through your liquidity through your government assets that are lying idle, all over the world. Those are some of the measures that government needs to look into. But much more important is the fact that we need to look into our waste as a nation. There's so much leakages going on in the government that makes it impractical for whatever revenue you are bringing in. Maybe only 20 to 30% of it actually count for value addition into the economy.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Onasami. We hope that this will reflect in the soonest possible time, in our debt management and servicing, especially with this warning coming from the World Bank. Lead partner at Cardinal Professionals, Mr. Emmanuel Onasami. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you.